A 6-year-old girl is found dead at home. A bizarre ransom note, a contaminated crime scene, and strange testimonies. Decades later, many questions still remain unanswered. What could the Ramseys be hiding? Imagine waking up in the middle of the night and discovering that your daughter is missing. Your heart races, panic takes over, and in a mix of desperation and confusion, you try to understand what happened. Now imagine that instead of a missing child, you find a ransom note inside your own home. And hours later, your daughter's body is discovered in the basement. That is exactly what happened in the Ramsey household on Christmas 1996. JonBenét, a girl of only 6 years old, was found dead inside her own home in one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. From the start, something seemed off. The note was too long, filled with strange details, and the demanded amount exactly matched the bonus that John Ramsey, the father, had received that year. The police were called quickly, but the crime scene was completely contaminated. Friends and family came in and out of the house without restrictions, and when JonBenét's body was finally found, it was her own father who carried her in his arms, further compromising any evidence that might have existed. From there, the media turned against the Ramseys. Patsy and John's calculated expressions during interviews, the way they tried to control the narrative. Everything seemed to indicate that they knew more than they were telling. But was the police too hasty in suspecting them? Was the truth buried under a botched investigation? Every year, new theories arise. Some point to a stranger who might have broken into the house. Others claim that the family covered up a terrible accident. But the question that still echoes today is, were the Ramseys protecting someone or themselves? Everything led to believe that JonBenét was the victim of a kidnapper. After all, a ransom note was there, detailing the ransom amount and threatening consequences if the police were called. But what if I told you that this note might be the biggest clue that there was never any kidnapping at all? Let's analyze the facts. The note spanned 3 entire pages. Kidnappers, in most cases, leave short, direct messages because time is a crucial factor. No criminal would spend precious minutes writing a long text inside the victim's home. And there's more. The paper and pen belonged to the Ramsey family. This means that whoever wrote it was comfortable enough to take the material and write right there. Another detail, the demanded amount was exactly the value of John Ramsey's annual bonus. What would a random kidnapper know about that? Then comes the bombshell. Handwriting analysis experts suggest that the note bears similarities to Patsy Ramsey's handwriting, JonBenét's mother. Now think about it. If a kidnapper had indeed taken JonBenét, why was her body found in the basement of her own home? What would explain such an elaborate note when the girl was already dead? Nothing in this crime follows the logic it should. Something was forged. Someone wanted the police to believe that a kidnapping had taken place. But if the Ramseys hid something, then why? There are 2 possibilities. The first is that they were protecting someone. The second is that they were protecting themselves. Their behavior after the crime was strange. She had barely looked for her daughter. Instead of frantically checking every corner of the house, she immediately assumed it was a kidnapping. And then there's a bizarre detail. When the 911 call was analyzed, experts noticed that before the phone was hung up, voices could still be heard in the background. And a whisper from Patsy, apparently to John, said, "What have we done?" In addition, there's JonBenét's brother, Burke Ramsey. At the time, he was 9 years old, and officially he was sleeping throughout the ordeal. But on the call recording, experts claim that it's possible to hear a child's voice in the background, meaning he might have been awake. This raises another question. What if JonBenét died accidentally that night? If that happened, the Ramseys had a strong motive to cover everything up. An accident at home could destroy their lives, and charges of negligence or something worse could lead to devastating consequences. So this doubt remains unanswered. Was JonBenét murdered by an intruder? Or did something happen inside that house that needed to be hidden at any cost? Imagine a huge house, decorated with Christmas lights, where a wealthy family celebrates the end-of-year holidays. Dinner was served, laughter echoed through the corridors, gifts were exchanged. But at some point that night, something terrible happened. JonBenét was found hours later, showing signs of strangulation and severe cranial trauma. Upstairs, her parents were in shock. The brother supposedly was asleep. But if everything happened within that house, how did no one hear anything? The story the Ramseys told never seemed to completely add up. Something happened that night that was never fully explained. And here's the question that changes everything. If it wasn't an intruder, then who was in the house that night? The evidence indicates that the answer might be right before our eyes. But before drawing conclusions, we need to analyze something even stranger. the DNA found at the crime scene. This detail might be the key to understanding whether the Ramseys were really hiding something or if they were victims of one of the most flawed criminal investigations in history. So if you want to understand what really happened that night, keep watching, because the next revelations might completely change your view of this case. When it comes to kidnappings, there is a very defined pattern. The criminal wants money and must act quickly. Kidnappers leave short and direct notes, with a clear demand and straightforward instructions. But the note found in the Ramsey house was completely different. It spanned 3 entire pages. Now stop and think. What kidnapper would have the time and patience to write such a long note inside the victim's home? It doesn't make sense. And what makes this situation even more suspicious is that forensic analysis confirmed that the paper and pen used to write the note belonged to the Ramsey family. In other words, someone took this material from inside the house, sat down, and wrote calmly. This eliminates any idea that a criminal rushed in, kidnapped JonBenét, and left without a trace. Another bizarre detail is the ransom amount demanded, exactly $118,000. This number is not random. It corresponds to the annual bonus that John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, had received that year. How would an outsider kidnapper know such a specific detail? And it doesn't stop there. Handwriting analysis experts have already pointed out that the note bears similarities to the handwriting of Patsy Ramsey, JonBenét's mother. Although there has never been an official confirmation, this theory raises an important question. If Patsy wrote the note, why would she do that? The structure of the text is also strange. The note contains highly emotional passages, as if it wanted to convey the idea of a desperate kidnapping. But real ransom demands are rational, cold, and direct. Kidnappers don't try to create a dramatic narrative. They simply state what they want and what will happen if their demands are not met. Now put all this information together. The overly long note, the fact that it was written inside the house, the exact amount of money, and the similarities to the mother's handwriting. Does this really sound like a crime committed by a random intruder? Or are we dealing with something much more complex? If this note wasn't written by a kidnapper, then what was its purpose? Some theories suggest that it was created to cover up something much bigger. Consider this. What if JonBenét died in that house and the note was a way to divert attention? If someone in the family had accidentally caused her death, the note would serve to create the illusion of a kidnapping and ward off any suspicion. Now look at the behavior of the Ramseys. When Patsy found the note, her first reaction was to call the police immediately. She never looked for JonBenét inside the house before calling the police. If you woke up and found a note like that, what would your immediate reaction be? Most likely you'd check every room in the house, panic, search for traces of your daughter. But Patsy did none of that. And there is an even more shocking detail. When the call to 911 was analyzed more carefully, it was discovered that after Patsy thought she had hung up, the microphone remained open for a few seconds. In the recording, it is possible to hear 3 voices in the background, which is strange because, officially, only Patsy and John were awake at that time. One of these voices sounds like that of a child, possibly Burke, JonBenét's brother. Then a whisper captured by the experts raises even more suspicions. Patsy says something that sounds like, "What have we done?" Now imagine this scenario. JonBenét dies in the house, possibly by accident. The parents are in shock, but instead of calling the police and risking being accused of negligence, or worse, they create a kidnapping story to deflect attention. In this case, the ransom note would serve to confuse the police and buy time. But like every poorly planned lie, it has obvious flaws. And perhaps that was the Ramseys' fatal error. And here is the most disturbing point. If all of this was fabricated, then JonBenét never had a real chance at justice. If the investigation focused on a non-existent kidnapper, it means that all the searches, all the clues, and all the resources were wasted following the wrong path. So here's the question. Could it be that the truth about JonBenét was inside that house all along and was deliberately hidden? Now let's analyze something even more disturbing. The behavior of the Ramseys after the crime and how they may have manipulated the investigation. When Patsy Ramsey called 911, it was expected that she would be in complete despair. However, what was heard on that call was something different. Her tone of voice, instead of conveying absolute panic, sounded more rehearsed, almost theatrical. The first thing that stands out in that call is the fact that Patsy did not look for JonBenét before phoning the police. This goes against the natural instinct of any parent. In a situation like this, the most common reaction would be to check every corner of the house, call out for your daughter, and run around in desperation. But Patsy did none of that. She found the ransom note, immediately called 911, and reported that her daughter had been kidnapped. But if JonBenét had really been taken, how could Patsy be so sure without even checking the girl's room or any other part of the house? When the police arrived, the situation became even more confusing. The Ramseys' behavior was unexpected, and the way they interacted with each other seemed disconnected from what one would expect from parents in shock. John Ramsey, for example, instead of acting like a desperate father, assumed a strange posture. While investigators were trying to gather information, he began organizing last-minute trips to leave town. Who would think of traveling in the midst of such a tragic situation? In addition, when the police arrived, the house was already filled with family friends who began moving around freely. This completely contaminated the crime scene, destroying potential evidence and hindering any forensic analysis. Then, there is the most disconcerting detail of all. The 911 call did not end when Patsy thought she had hung up the phone. Investigators managed to recover the last seconds of the recording and claim that two unsettling phrases were captured. The first seems to be Patsy saying, "What have we done?" And immediately after, a child's voice can be heard, possibly Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother. But according to the Ramseys, Burke was asleep the entire time. If Burke was asleep, how was his voice captured on the recording? And furthermore, why would Patsy say, "What have we done?" instead of "What happened?" or any other less accusatory phrase? This solitary detail already raises many questions. And what if Burke was indeed awake and knew more about that night than his parents admitted? As the hours and days passed, investigators began to realize that something was off about the Ramseys' behavior. Instead of being cooperative and eager to help, they seemed more concerned with avoiding suspicion than finding answers. During interrogations, John and Patsy refused to be interviewed separately. This is a very important detail. Parents who have lost a child usually do everything to cooperate with the police. They want the case solved. They want justice. But the Ramseys insisted on being together during any official questioning, and when they were finally interviewed, their versions of the events that night were inconsistent. What John said did not match what Patsy. Small contradictions emerged, and every time they were pressed on an important detail, their responses sounded generic or vague. But perhaps the most revealing moment was the interview they gave to the press shortly after the crime. Behavior experts who analyzed that interview noticed something that caught a lot of attention. The Ramseys' focus was not on their daughter who had just died, but on themselves. Patsy, at several points, would avert her gaze and speak in a robotic manner, almost as if she were reciting a rehearsed speech. John, on the other hand, seemed to want to display his pain, but couldn't express it genuinely. And then comes another detail that experts refer to as the Zeigarnik effect. This psychological phenomenon explains why our brains don't handle unfinished stories well. In other words, when someone is trying to maintain a complex lie, the brain struggles to keep all the details aligned, and the longer the time passes, the harder it becomes to sustain the original narrative. And that is exactly what began to happen with the Ramseys. Small lapses started to appear. Answers that once seemed natural began to sound disjointed. Nervousness grew. Could this difficulty in maintaining a coherent story indicate guilt? Or was it just the result of the extreme trauma they were experiencing? Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. The way the Ramseys reacted made them appear guilty in the eyes of both the public and the police. Let's dive even deeper into this behavior and analyze the DNA examination found at the crime scene and what it really means for the case. The discovery of an unknown male DNA on JonBenét's clothing seemed to be the key piece of evidence that would finally explain what happened that night. For many, this detail should have completely changed the course of the investigation. After all, if the DNA didn't belong to any of the Ramseys, it would mean that another person was involved in the crime, right? But it wasn't quite like that. The amount of genetic material found was minimal, almost insignificant for a definitive analysis. Experts pointed out that it could have been factory contamination, traces from casual contact, or even an error in the collection process. Even so, the family's lawyers clung to this information as absolute proof that John and Patsy were innocent. This created a stalemate in the investigation. If the DNA belonged to a stranger, then the police would have to look for another suspect. But without a clear enough sample for comparison, there was no way to move forward. Years passed without this evidence providing any answers. But then came a new breakthrough. With the development of genetic databases, old cases began to be solved. The most famous example was the Golden State Killer, a serial killer who remained unidentified for over 40 years until his identity was discovered through the DNA of distant relatives. This opened up a new path, If the DNA from JonBenét's crime scene is entered into these modern databases, there is a real chance of identifying whom it belongs to. And if that information is discovered, it could be the detail that finally reveals who was really in that house that night. The question is, will this technology be used before it's too late? Even decades later, JonBenét Ramsey's story remains shrouded in uncertainty. With each new piece of information, new questions arise. The Ramseys spent years trying to clear their image, insisting that they were victims of a botched investigation. But their behavior that night, the inconsistencies, the suspicious attitudes, and the rush to deflect any suspicion from themselves still raises doubts. If the police had taken a different path from the start, could this case have already been solved? Science has advanced. Today we have resources that didn't exist back then. But the big question is, are the authorities really interested in reopening this case and uncovering the truth? Many people believe there is information that has never been revealed to the public, that there are secrets buried so deeply in this case that they may never come to light. The JonBenét case has never ceased to generate doubts. Decades later, we still don't know if the Ramseys were victims or if they hid something that never came out. The media built narratives, the police made mistakes, and the truth remains out of reach. But will this story ever be completely clarified? Or will it remain another mystery without an answer? If you've come this far, comment, "I want the truth," so I know you followed everything. And if you like cases that defy logic, watch the next video. There's another mystery that will leave you intrigued.